So for this problem, we wanted to know, or we were told, a 60-foot high escalator can lift or lower a person at about 8.87 feet per second from the ground floor. Toby is taking the escalator down from the second floor. Write a function that represents Toby's height after h seconds. So his height is the dependent variable because his height is going to depend on how long he's on the escalator. So his height is the dependent, and time, the seconds he's on it, is the independent. So his function is going to be h of s. And if we look at his height, he's starting 60 feet off the ground and going down at 0.87 feet per second. So theoretically, if I think of my two rules, I can't divide by 0, and I can't square root a negative. So that's not happening in this equation at all. There's no division or there's no square roots. So I know that the seconds can be all real numbers. Any number is theoretically going to work in this equation. Practically speaking, though, Toby can only be on the elevator for a positive number of seconds. So his time needs to be, his practical domain needs to start at 0, and he has to get off the escalator at some point. So if I think about it, he's only going to be on the escalator for however long it takes him to get to the ground. So 60 divided by 0.87 seconds tells me that in about 69 seconds he'll be on the ground floor. So at 70 seconds, he'd no longer be on the escalator. So the only time that makes sense for him is 0 to 69 seconds. So on page 11, they want us to decide what the theoretical domain would be for this function. So the rule that this would violate is that I can't square root a negative. So whenever v plus 5 turns out to be negative, I know that I'm going to have a negative under the square root. So essentially, I want v plus 5 to only ever be greater than or equal to 0. And if I solve that, I get that my domain are only the numbers greater than or equal to negative 5. So my domain are the values of v that are greater than or equal to negative 5. So for instance, if I were to plug in h of negative 7, a number that's not in my domain, I'd get the square root of negative 7 plus 5, which is the square root of negative 2. That can't happen. So I can only take values that are greater than or equal to negative 5. So we essentially find that by setting the inside of the square root to be greater than or equal to 0. So for D, I have that basically I have 3x plus 4 divided by 2x minus 1, and I can't divide by 0. So essentially, whenever this denominator becomes 0, I'm going to have an undefined function. So I don't want 2x minus 1 to ever be equal to 0, because when that happens, I'm dividing by 0. So if I solve for x, I get that x cannot be 1/2. Because if I plug in 1/2, I would get dividing by 0, which is not allowed. So my domain is every single number. So x can be any real number except x cannot be 1/4.